Let me share with you a story that may stir memories of your own youth. A story about a young man named Calvin Lewis who arrived at the prestigious Westlake Academy with hope in his heart, despite coming from the bustling, often harsh streets of South Chicago. Calvin's gift for music was as natural as breathing, yet his journey was marred by a bitter struggle against a system that seemed determined to see him fail. From the moment he stepped onto the campus, with its grand brick facade, immaculate lawns, and stately stone columns that looked more at home in a well-to-do suburb than in his modest past, Calvin felt both the promise of opportunity and the sting of exclusion. He clutched the worn strap of his backpack as if it were a lifeline, and the voices of sharply dressed students filled the air with a sense of entitlement and ease that only deepened his feeling of being out of place. As he made his way along the corridor, a gentle yet patronizing voice called out, "You must be Mr. Lewis," and Calvin turned to see Principal Harrington, a balding man with kind eyes, extending his hand in a greeting that was both warm and laden with unspoken expectations. "Welcome to Westlake. Your scholarship is quite an achievement," Principal Harrington said, his tone polished and reassuring, though the word scholarship now felt less like a commendation and more like a label that set Calvin apart from his privileged peers. With his schedule in hand, Calvin learned that his first advanced music class would be taught by none other than Mrs. Eleanor Wright, a name that would soon become synonymous with cruelty in his eyes. Walking into the music room was like entering another world entirely. The room was bathed in natural light from large windows, and the gleaming instruments arranged neatly on stands spoke of an opulence that seemed as unreachable to Calvin as a distant dream. At the front of the classroom stood Mrs. Wright, her blonde hair pulled tightly back into a severe bun, and her posture rigid with an air of superiority. Her pearl earrings caught the light as she scrutinized Calvin from head to toe, her eyes lingering on his worn shoes and modest attire. "You must be our new scholarship student," she said in a measured tone, as if the very word scholarship were a mark of deficiency rather than a badge of honor. "Please find a seat." In that moment, the room's atmosphere shifted from mere formality to one of quiet judgment, and Calvin's heart sank under the weight of her dismissive tone. Taking a seat at the back of the room, Calvin listened as Mrs. Wright began her lecture on Vivaldi with a refined accent that betrayed years of training at Europe's finest music conservatories. "As I was saying," she declared, "true musical aptitude requires years of proper training. It is not something that can be acquired casually or through exposure to popular music alone." Her gaze flicked briefly in his direction, sending a chill down his spine, and several students shifted uncomfortably as if to signal that Calvin did not belong. Even though a kind-eyed girl named Sophia offered him a small smile of sympathy from across the room, the isolation that Calvin felt only grew with every word Mrs. Wright spoke, each syllable a reminder of the gap between his natural talent and the polished technique expected at Westlake. One by one, his classmates were called to demonstrate their skills on violins, flutes, and clarinets. Calvin sat quietly, his fingers twitching as if they were yearning to play an invisible melody, while the other students performed with practiced confidence. When a tall, well-groomed young man named Aidan picked up his violin and played a complex passage flawlessly, Mrs. Wright's praise was both effusive and patronizing. "Exquisite technique. This is what 8 years of private instruction produces," she said, placing a congratulatory hand on Aidan's shoulder. With each compliment she lavished on others, the chasm between Calvin's self-taught passion and the refined skill expected in her class widened, deepening the conflict between his inner resolve and her harsh judgments. When the bell finally rang, Mrs. Wright summoned Calvin to her desk. With a mixture of trepidation and a flicker of hope he approached, only to be met with her icy blue eyes and a tone that left no room for understanding. "I understand you indicated an interest in music on your application," she said without looking up from her papers. "But do you play any instruments with proper training?" In a quiet, hesitant voice, Calvin replied, "I play a little." At those words, her eyes turned cold as winter winds, and she replied sharply, "At Westlake, we do not play a little. We strive for excellence. This is not a program for beginners or hobbyists." Though Calvin nodded silently, inside he felt as if each syllable were a blow, a constant reminder that his natural talent and humble beginnings were not enough to measure up to the lofty standards set by her. As he walked out of the classroom, Calvin overheard Mrs. Wright confiding in another teacher, These diversity scholarships are well-intentioned, but they really should consider the students' backgrounds more carefully. The word stung deeply, transforming the scholarship that his mother had once celebrated into a brand marking him as an outsider, a label that branded him with perpetual inadequacy. Throughout his first week, he learned to navigate a social landscape fraught with whispered judgments and stinging glances. He spoke little and listened much, all the while silently enduring the unrelenting pressure of expectations that were clearly not meant for him. After one class, the kind, dark-haired girl Sophia approached him and introduced herself with a warmth that belied the coldness of the day. "I'm Sophia," she said, extending her hand gently. "You're Calvin, right? Don't let Mrs. Wright get to you. She treats everyone as if they are auditioning for Juilliard." Her words, meant to offer comfort, only deepened Calvin's awareness of the stark contrast between his own struggles and the effortless polish of his classmates. Though he managed a small, grateful smile, their brief conversation was abruptly interrupted by Aidan, who hurriedly announced that he was late for his study group, leaving Calvin feeling even more isolated and unimportant. In a moment of reprieve during history class, Calvin found solace in the encouraging words of Mr. Thompson, a spirited teacher whose genuine interest in his students shone through. After complimenting Calvin on his insightful analysis of economic factors in his paper, Mr. Thompson pulled him aside and asked how he was settling in. With a weary shrug, Calvin admitted, "It's different." Mr. Thompson's face grew serious as he inquired which teacher was causing him trouble, and Calvin's voice dropped as he confessed, "Mrs. Wright, the music teacher." Mr. Thompson's expression hardened as he explained, "Eleanor Wright holds very traditional views about music and many other things. She doesn't believe you belong here." Yet, despite the weight of her disapproval, Calvin quietly vowed to prove her wrong, even as Mr. Thompson reminded him that his worth was not defined by someone else's narrow standards. Later that day, unable to resist the magnetic pull of the music room, Calvin found himself lingering after school when the hallways had emptied. The room was silent except for the soft gleam of the instruments that lined the walls, each one a symbol of a world he yearned to join. Drawn to a polished violin case that sparkled under the gentle light, he carefully opened it to reveal an instrument that seemed to whisper promises of beauty and escape. In that quiet, private moment, he lifted the violin and let the bow glide across its strings, producing a pure, soulful note that filled the empty space with a fleeting sense of hope. But just as his heart began to swell with the possibility of acceptance, he was startled by the sudden appearance of Mrs. Wright. "Mr. Lewis, this room is closed outside of class hours," she declared sharply, her tone brooking no argument. With a soft apology, Calvin mumbled, "I was just looking," and hurriedly withdrew, her cold, satisfied gaze searing into him and amplifying the deep injustice he felt. Over the following weeks, the pattern of cruelty and relentless judgment grew ever more apparent. In class, Mrs. Wright's comments became more biting and laden with scorn. After a particularly polished demonstration by Aidan, she pronounced, "Talent without discipline is worthless, and self-taught musicians develop habits that are nearly impossible to correct." Each word struck Calvin like a harsh chord, reinforcing the gap between his genuine, heartfelt passion and the rigid, elitist standards imposed upon him. The scholarship, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a heavy chain, a constant reminder of how different he was from those who had been nurtured by privilege and formal training. Every day after school, Calvin endured long hours at Joe's Corner Market, where he stocked shelves and ran the register until 9 p.m. The modest earnings were sent directly to help his mother manage mounting bills, ever since the untimely death of his father had left their family struggling. On Sundays, when he had a brief respite, he devoted his time to his grandmother's church, setting up chairs and sometimes playing for the youth choir on an old, cherished violin that once belonged to his grandfather. Though that instrument was far from the pristine violins at Westlake, it carried with it memories of a man who had played with passion and grace, a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive world Calvin faced at school. One day, as Calvin was about to leave after class, Mrs. Wright stopped him with a tone that brooked no further discussion. "Calvin, you have been here almost a month now," she said, her voice laced with disdain, "and while everyone else participates in demonstrations, your continued mere observation is unacceptable for grading purposes." Her words stung deeply, underscoring the fact that his lack of formal training, stemming not from a lack of talent but from a life filled with hardship, rendered him unworthy of a place in her classroom. "I do not have an instrument here," Calvin replied softly, his voice trembling with both resolve and sorrow. "The school provides instruments," she retorted coolly, adding that she would need to know his proficiency level before assigning one. In that quiet moment, Calvin's thoughts drifted to his childhood, to the memory of his grandfather patiently guiding his small fingers over the violin strings from the tender age of 6, and to the soulful jazz standards and improvisation techniques that had defined his early years, an education not measured in conservatory degrees but in love, perseverance, and raw, unbridled expression. Mrs. Wright's response was devoid of any warmth as she asked, "And does your grandfather have conservatory training?" Her question, simple on the surface, was loaded with cruelty, as if dismissing the deep emotional connection and history that had given Calvin his gift. "He passed away," Calvin answered quietly, concealing the pain that still echoed in his heart, "but he played professionally for years." With a dismissive sigh, she glanced at her watch and announced, "Next week we begin our performance evaluations. Everyone must participate or receive a failing grade. Perhaps you should consider another elective if you are not prepared for the rigors of this class," she added with a tone that tried to sound admiring, yet reeked of condescension. It is admirable that Westlake offers these opportunities to diverse students, but sometimes the gap in preparation is simply too wide to bridge. As Calvin turned to leave, the oppressive weight of her words settled over him like a relentless storm, leaving him feeling isolated, misunderstood, and more determined than ever to prove that his worth could never be measured by someone so cruel and narrow in her expectations. Calvin had barely caught his breath from the constant barrage of disdain when the next incident unfolded, a moment that would etch itself in his memory as yet another instance of injustice. It began when, after a brief pause in the music class, one of his classmates, Aidan, suddenly demanded in an accusatory tone, "Were you touching the violins?" The sharp tone of his voice cut through the room as he pointed an accusing finger at Calvin, who stood frozen by a violin case that had just been closed. Aidan's words carried a weight of accusation that made it clear he believed Calvin had overstepped a boundary that he was never meant to cross. It was a moment that stung even more, because it was not only about an innocent curiosity, but a deliberate attempt to expose Calvin as an interloper among students who were born into privilege and formal training. Before Calvin could gather his thoughts, Mrs. Wright appeared behind Aidan. Today, she was dressed in an elegant, carefully chosen outfit that was a far cry from her usual drab teaching clothes. Her presence was imposing, and her voice carried a chill that seemed to solidify the tension in the room. "I was touching the violins," she declared sharply. Her eyes narrowed dangerously as she fixed her gaze on Calvin. "That instrument is worth more than your scholarship. What gives you the right to handle it without permission?" she demanded, her tone dripping with cruelty and an air of entitlement that left Calvin feeling even smaller than before. He tried to explain in a soft, measured voice that he had not damaged anything, saying simply, "I was just looking," but his words fell flat under the weight of her condescension. Mrs. Wright's response was swift and merciless. "These instruments are for serious musicians," she snapped, "not for satisfying curiosity." At that moment, Calvin's heart pounded in his ears as he mustered the courage to say, "I am a musician." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and for a brief second there was silence in the room. Then Mrs. Wright let out a small, disbelieving laugh that echoed like a final verdict on his abilities. "A musician? Based on what evidence exactly?" she challenged, her voice laced with scorn as she reminded everyone in the room that Calvin had contributed nothing in her class for nearly a month. Calvin's eyes burned with a mixture of humiliation and defiance. He knew there were other forms of music and other ways to learn that did not conform to the rigid, elitist standards that Mrs. Wright so adamantly upheld. "Not everything is about your class," he said quietly, a rare flash of boldness piercing through his normally careful reserve. Mrs. Wright's face flushed with anger, and she retorted in a voice as cold as ice. "There are other kinds of music than the ones you teach, I suppose, but here at Westlake we maintain standards. Standards that clearly some scholarship students are not prepared to meet." To Calvin, that word, scholarship, felt like a slap. a constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, his background would forever be seen as a disadvantage. Aidan, who had been watching with a smirk, added his own sneer to the unfolding drama, prompting Calvin to turn away from the group, seeking a brief escape from the relentless humiliation. But before he could retreat completely, Mrs. Wright's next words struck even deeper. "I have been meaning to discuss your work schedule with you," she announced, in a tone that suggested that Calvin's personal hardships were nothing more than an inconvenience. Westlake students are expected to prioritize their studies and school activities. Outside employment is discouraged, especially for those on academic scholarships who are expected to maintain certain grade requirements. Her words sent a shock of cold disbelief through Calvin. In a trembling voice he explained, "My family needs the money." But Mrs. Wright dismissed his explanation as if it were a trivial excuse, remarking flatly, "That is unfortunate, but you accepted a position at this institution, and our expectations do not change based on your personal circumstances." Each word burned like acid inside him, a reminder that his struggles were invisible to those in power, that his genuine need was met only with contempt and disregard. Later that night, when the noise of the day had finally subsided and the quiet of his modest room enveloped him, Calvin retrieved his grandfather's old violin from its worn case. In the soft lamplight, with his mother working a night shift and his younger sister fast asleep, he allowed himself a moment of solace. His fingers moved gingerly over the strings as he played a tender melody his grandfather had taught him long ago. The notes carried a bittersweet mixture of grief and hope, a private confession of all that he had endured at Westlake. In those moments, the music reminded him of the man he truly was, a musician with a soulful connection to his heritage, a connection that was constantly belittled by the narrow definitions imposed upon him by Mrs. Wright. The following day brought with it the dreaded performance evaluation week. Mrs. Wright had posted a schedule on the classroom door, assigning each student a 15-minute slot to demonstrate their progress. When Calvin's name appeared at the very bottom of the list, marked with a question mark, he felt a deepening of that sense of alienation. The evaluation was meant to account for 40% of the semester grade, and the pressure in the room was palpable as students clutched sheet music and nervously practiced their finger positions. The murmurs of preparation anxiety filled the air, each student aware that failure was not an option. During class, Mrs. Wright's gaze swept over the room before finally landing on Calvin. "Mr. Lewis, I do not see your selection on my list," she called out in a tone that was both mocking and condescending. "What will you be performing?" All eyes in the room turned toward him, and for a moment Calvin hesitated, unprepared for the direct confrontation. "I haven't decided yet," he murmured, feeling the weight of judgment in every word. Mrs. Wright's lips curved into a smile that was anything but genuine as she said, "You haven't decided. The evaluation begins tomorrow." Before Calvin could muster a response, she continued, "I have noticed your particular interest in the violin demonstrations. Perhaps that is your instrument of choice." Her words, delivered with artificial brightness, were met with silence from Calvin, whose eyes betrayed the inner turmoil of being cornered once again. "Splendid," she declared. "We have an opening tomorrow afternoon. I will put you down for the Vivaldi piece we have been studying." At that, Calvin's heart sank as he admitted softly, "I do not have that prepared." Mrs. Wright tilted her head as if incredulity were an art form. "No, then what do you have prepared? Surely, with all your years of playing, you must have something performance-ready." Her challenge was unmistakable, and the tension in the room escalated further with every passing second. From across the room, Sophia shot him a sympathetic glance, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and encouragement, but her presence did little to alleviate the crushing pressure. The conversation soon turned to matters beyond the music. "Actually, I can play something," Calvin said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper, "but not Vivaldi." Mrs. Wright's response was steeped in dismissive condescension as she declared, "This is a classical music program, Mr. Lewis. What exactly were you planning to play? Something from your church, perhaps?" Her words were laced with scorn, and the implication was clear. His background was inferior, unworthy of the prestigious stage of Westlake. Before the situation could escalate further, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. Principal Harrington had arrived, folder in hand, with a pretext of dropping off donor forms for an upcoming concert series. "I would be quite interested to hear what Mr. Lewis can do," he said, his tone sounding warm and encouraging. The sudden presence of the principal brought a brief moment of relief to Calvin, though it did little to erase the lingering sting of Mrs. Wright's words. Mrs. Wright's smile froze, and she quickly responded, "Of course, Principal Harrington. We would be honored." But as soon as the principal left, her tone hardened once more. "Well, Mr. Lewis, it seems you will have a very special audience tomorrow," she warned, with a level of cruelty that made it clear her intentions were to humiliate him further. That evening, after a long day of relentless pressure, Calvin made a difficult call to his boss at the corner market, explaining that a family emergency meant he could not work that night. Instead, he devoted the quiet hours of the evening to practicing on his grandfather's cherished violin. For hours he played with a raw passion, his fingers rediscovering long-forgotten patterns, and his soul finding solace in each note. He knew that tomorrow would bring a reckoning, an evaluation that Mrs. Wright had engineered to showcase his supposed inadequacies. And yet, the music filled him with a fragile hope that one day, perhaps, she might see beyond her narrow prejudices. The next day, the music room had been rearranged to resemble an auditorium. Chairs were set up in rows facing a grand piano, and the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Duduns trickled in nervously, some clutching instrument cases, and others holding onto their sheet music as if it were a lifeline. Calvin arrived right on time for his 3:15 performance slot, only to find that a larger crowd than expected had gathered. Not only were his classmates present, but several teachers, including those from algebra and English, had also taken an interest. A sign that even those who normally remained silent were drawn into the unfolding drama. In the back row, Principal Harrington sat beside Mr. Thompson, whose encouraging nod had done little to calm the butterflies in Calvin's stomach. At the front of the room, Mrs. Wright stood with her hair pulled back and her pearl earrings catching the light streaming through the tall windows. Her crisp blazer and pencil skirt added to the air of authority she projected, and as she checked items off her clipboard, her gaze fell upon Calvin. "Ah, Mr. Lewis," she said loudly as he entered the room, her voice echoing in the now silent space. "We were just discussing whether you would be making an appearance. I am so glad you could join us." The undercurrent of mockery in her tone was unmistakable, and a few teachers exchanged glances as if to acknowledge the farce unfolding before them. Mrs. Wright continued, "I believe you are our final performer today," she added with a tight smile. "Everyone else has demonstrated considerable preparation and skill, and I do hope you have brought your selection." Calvin nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the array of violin cases arranged on a table near the piano. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Mrs. Wright walked to the table, selected a case and opened it carefully to reveal a reproduction of a 1721 Stradivarius, a $250,000 instrument that shone under the bright lights. "This is a $250,000 instrument, Mr. Lewis," she announced, her tone both proud and patronizing. "I trust you will handle it appropriately." The weight of every eye in the room bore down on him as he stepped forward to take the instrument, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could begin, Mrs. Wright demanded, "Perhaps you might tell us about your musical background before you start. Your private instructors, the competitions you have participated in, what qualifies you to play this instrument?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Calvin stood there, the heavy instrument in his hands, feeling its unfamiliar weight as if it were a symbol of all the expectations and prejudices that he had been forced to carry. With a quiet steadiness that belied the humiliation he felt, he answered, "I did not have private instructors, my grandfather taught me." At those words, Mrs. Wright's surprise seemed almost performative. "Your grandfather?" she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "And was he a professional violinist with the symphony, perhaps?" For the first time, Calvin looked directly into her eyes and spoke with a calm conviction. He played jazz. The room reacted as if the very air had thickened. The word hung there, a declaration of a different kind of music that did not fit into Mrs. Wright's narrow confines. Mrs. Wright's nose wrinkled slightly, and though she maintained a veneer of curiosity, her tone dripped with condescension as she said, How interesting. We are certainly eager to hear what such an unconventional background has produced. Please, whenever you're ready." Even as she glanced at the other teachers, it was clear that she was determined to expose Calvin's differences rather than celebrate them. In that moment, as Calvin gripped the bow and prepared to perform for an audience that seemed poised to judge him at every note, the entire room felt like a stage for a cruel contest. And though the humiliation was deep and the stakes unbearably high, his music carried a power that no amount of prejudice could silence. Calvin Lewis stood before the stern gaze of Mrs. Wright and a room full of sneers and whispers. She insisted that Westlake graded solely on classical technique and ridiculed his self-taught style. Aidan's smirk and Sophia's doubtful look deepened his humiliation as he struggled with the shoulder rest of the prized violin. His hands trembled under relentless scrutiny, and Mrs. Wright reminded him that time was running out, threatening to schedule him for another day if he failed to perform. With a heavy heart and memories of his beloved grandfather echoing in his mind, Calvin recalled sitting on his grandfather's knee in a modest Southside Chicago apartment, where music was a soulful language born of struggle and hope. Determined, he placed the violin beneath his chin, drew the bow, and began with Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor. His fingers moved with precision while adding a bluesy twist that challenged Mrs. Wright's narrow expectations. The room fell silent as he seamlessly transitioned into Paganini and then the haunting strains of Strange Fruit, a protest of pain and resilience. In that moment, Calvin's music spoke louder than any prejudice. The audience's applause washed away cruelty, leaving Mrs. Wright mute. Calvin Lewis felt both relief and apprehension as Mr. Thompson placed a supportive hand on his shoulder after the performance. "I think you fulfilled your evaluation requirements admirably," he said softly, guiding Calvin away from the buzzing crowd. In the hallway, Calvin learned with a sinking heart that his powerful performance was already circulating on social media. He murmured, "They recorded it," and Mr. Thompson replied, "You deliver truth that cannot be contained." At home, his mother, still in her work scrub, looked at him with pride and confusion as her phone buzzed non-stop. The video, with captions condemning Mrs. Wright for her cruel setup, had amassed tens of thousands of views, sparking heated debates about educational bias and access. The next day, Calvin found himself the center of unwanted attention. Teachers who once overlooked him now greeted him warmly, while students whispered his name in awe. Later, Principal Harrington summoned him to his office with a local news crew waiting. As Calvin recounted his hardships, losing his father, his mother working double shifts, and his struggle to keep his family afloat, Mrs. Wright's harsh, dismissive voice was exposed before the board. The meeting left no doubt that her bias had wounded a young man who only ever wanted to learn and be seen for who he truly was. Calvin Lewis looked directly at Mrs. Wright and spoke with quiet resolve. He declared he was not the student she assumed he must be, and that music does not belong to a single tradition or a specific type of person, but to anyone willing to pour their heart into it. His words filled the silent room with undeniable truth, challenging the cruelty and narrow-mindedness that had marked his evaluation. Chairman Templeton cleared his throat and apologized on behalf of the board, admitting that Westlake Academy would be diminished without Calvin's unique perspective. He informed Mrs. Wright that she was placed on administrative leave immediately, a decision that laid bare her harsh biases and vindictive actions. After the meeting, Calvin found himself surrounded by board members eager to learn about his grandfather's legacy and his own promising future. His quiet dignity and resilience in the face of relentless prejudice had transformed him from a marginalized scholarship student into an inspiring symbol of hope. In the following weeks, Westlake changed in profound ways. The school revamped its diversity training, expanded its music curriculum to include non-European traditions, and updated its promotional materials to celebrate a broader range of talents. Walking the hallways with newfound confidence, Calvin was greeted warmly by peers and teachers who had once overlooked him. One afternoon, Calvin noticed Mrs. Wright sitting alone at a piano. Though still on probation, she had returned to limited teaching duties. Approaching her with genuine resolve, Calvin proposed a duet for the spring showcase, a piece blending classical structure with jazz improvisation. Music builds bridges where words fail, he explained softly, and in that moment, old grudges began to melt away. Mrs. Wright's eyes softened as she recognized the consequences of her cruelty. Westlake had embraced a new era of inclusion, and Calvin's triumphant performance proved that true excellence arises when we dare to be ourselves.